In this video, we're going to simplify complex numbers using the multiplication property of square roots. In doing so, we'll make sure that we write each complex number using I. So, the square root of negative 17 is the first number that we look at. So with the square root of negative 17, 17 doesn't have any perfect square factors, so there's not going to be anything that I can simplify there. All that I'm going to do is break this apart into the square root of, and I'll think of it as the square root of negative 1 times 17. And then I can use the multiplication property to break that down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 17. And so I'm going to write this as I times the square root of 17. Again, that's putting this number into what's called standard form, and it makes it so that instead of having a negative inside the square root, we simply are using I outside of it. Looking at b here, we have the square root of negative 24. So we're going to do the same process by bringing out I instead of having a negative inside that square root. And then we'll also look at simplifying 24 inside the radical. We'll do that by finding its largest perfect square factor. So to start, let's just break this apart into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 24. And so we'll look at that as I times the square root of 24. So now that we have I out, we're going to go through and look for the largest perfect square factor of 24, which happens to be 4. So we'll break this down then into the square root of 4 times 6, and we're doing that so that we can then use the multiplication property and write it as the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. And again, I is still out front, so I have I times the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. My goal in looking at that largest perfect square factor is that the square root of 4 now breaks down into an integer, and it breaks down into 2. So now I have I times 2 times the square root of 6. And in general, I'll write this as 2I times the square root of 6. The last example we have is 3 plus the square root of negative 75. So the first thing that we're going to do is bring I out instead of having a negative inside that square root, and then we'll look to simplify the square root of 75 using the multiplication property of square roots. So for this one, we can write this as 3 plus, and we'll break this down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 75. So that will be 3 plus I times the square root of 75. And now I want to simplify the square root of 75. I'll do that by determining its largest perfect square factor and then applying the multiplication property for square roots. So from here, the largest perfect square factor of 75 is 25, so this will break down to 3 plus, and then I still have I, and then I'm going to write, inside that radical, I'm going to write it as 25 times 3. From there, applying the multiplication property for square roots, I'll have 3 plus I times the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And so that will be 3 plus I times 5 times the square root of 3. And in general, I will write that as 5I instead of I times 5. So I'll have 3 plus 5I times the square root of 3. And again, there's nothing that can combine any further here. 3 plus 5 can't be combined because the multiplication by I and the square root of 3 is higher in the order of operations. So that expression is fully simplified and written in standard form.